When Robert Francis Prevost was announced as the new pope and took the name Leo XIV, the media rushed to label him as the first American pope. The headlines featured him with the United States flag in the background. His biography highlighted his birth in Chicago, and many commentators began to speculate about what this meant for the Vatican's international politics. But there was more, something that didn't fit into the headlines or the flags. Leo XIV is not only American, he is also Peruvian, and not by mere paperwork, but by soul. Few know that Robert Prevost not only lived in Peru, he became a naturalized Peruvian citizen by personal choice. It was more than a formality. It was a gesture of belonging, of love, of embodied faith. He arrived as an Augustinian missionary in Chulucanas in the 1980s, a region marked by rural poverty, the absence of the state, and the growing threat of armed conflict. He didn't come with the airs of a savior. He arrived on foot, with humility, a Bible in hand, and his ears wide open. Instead of living apart, he integrated into the community as one of them. He learned the language, the idioms, the customs. He ate what the farmers ate. He walked among the hills to reach communities without light or water. He celebrated Mass where there was no altar. He brought basic medicine, clothes, comfort. And when he spoke, he didn't do so as a foreigner. He spoke as a brother. The farmers of northern Peru still remember him as the gringo who walked barefoot. He sought no recognition, no promotions. He sought souls and found them in the dust of the roads, in the calloused hands of the elders, in the eyes of children who couldn't read but understood love when they saw it embodied. It was in that context that Prevost requested Peruvian nationality, not out of convenience, not as a strategy, but because he understood that his vocation was not split between two countries. It was woven by both. Chicago had given him his roots, Peru his fruit. This dual identity that many are unaware of or don't comprehend is not an anecdotal detail. It is the key to understanding his style, his sensitivity, his way of being church. Because Leo XIV does not embody the traditional model of a European pope formed in. The corridors of the Vatican face a distinct profile, one that has experienced the peripheries, forged in the global south, speaking from the border between the first world and the forgotten world. In the words of a priest who accompanied him during his years in mission, he did not come to teach, he came to learn, and that's why we follow him. His dual nationality, far from dividing him, unifies him because he represents a church that does not belong to a single continent, a church that, like him, naturalizes with the suffering people, that does not limit itself to representing the North nor embodying the South, but embraces both from the depths of Christian compassion. When he was consecrated bishop in Peru, the faithful called him Father Bob, with a foreign accent but with a heart as Andean as the hills that saw him serve. And when he returned to Rome, many thought he had left that phase behind, but he carried it with him in his gaze, in his style, in his faith. Today, as Pope, that root has not been erased. It is deepened. The man who wears white today is the same who once carried a wooden cross among forgotten communities. The same one who was embraced by farmers who could not read but knew how to love. The same one who, though born on the asphalt of Chicago, became dust on the roads of deep Peru. Robert Francis Prevost never intended to divide his life between two cultures. His vocation was not international, it was radically local. And yet he ended up embodying the universality of the Church in a way that few popes have experienced so closely. Yes, he was born in Chicago, but it was in the cracked warmth of northern Peru where he learned to read the gospel, not just with his eyes, but with his feet, where he understood that faith is not imposed from cathedrals, but discovered in the faces of those who barely survive, where he discovered that true authority is not that of the title, but that of the one who walks with the people. The story of his arrival in Peru is not grandiloquent. He did not arrive as a special envoy. He came as part of a small, young Augustinian community, with a strong accent, with doubts, with fear, but with an absolute willingness to let the lives of others shape his own. He began by visiting homes, celebrating outdoor masses, listening to women praying for missing children, blessing hands wounded by the machete in the fields. He learned more in rural kitchens than in theology books. He learned that faith is pronounced in Spanish, but is shouted in silence. An elderly farmer in the Conchac district of Piura once said, "Father Bob was not Peruvian when he arrived, but he became one of us with the dust." That phrase encapsulates something that no official document can explain, the silent embodiment of a calling. Because Prevost did not adapt to Peru, he allowed himself to be transformed by it. When he decided to apply for nationality, he did not do it for legal benefits. He did it to tell the people, "I am from here," to declare that his identity was not anchored in his passport, but in his spiritual experience, to affirm that his vocation was not ecclesiastical tourism, but evangelical belonging. And so it was. The Peruvian government granted him nationality, but it was the people who adopted him. It was the people without power or title or office who made him their own. That dual identity, that intertwining of worlds, would mark his entire subsequent journey. When he briefly returned to the United States, he felt alien. When he went back to Rome to take on new responsibilities, he carried in his suitcase the names, the wounds, and the silences of his Andean mission. As a bishop, as a prefect, and now as pope, he has not stopped referring to Peru as his spiritual home. He has cited his missionary experience as his true school of leadership. He has acknowledged that it was the poor who taught him how to be a church. In his recent words as Pope Leon XIV, he made it clear, the church has no passport, it has a face. And the face of Christ continues to appear where the world does not want to look. That is why, when the media rushed to call him the American Pope, within the Vatican itself, some cardinals felt uncomfortable, not for political reasons, but for spiritual precision, because they knew, and quietly said, that limiting him to a nationality was to lose sight of the essential. A Latin American cardinal who participated in the conclave expressed it this way: "We did not choose a pope from Chicago. We chose a shepherd formed by the South, by the mud, by the quiet resistance of the humble people. And that dual soul, North and South, asphalt and earth, is not a contradiction. It is his strength." Because in a divided world, Leon XV represents a living bridge, one that does not settle for crossing borders, but embraces them. In a world where the public image of a pope is often marked by solemnity, liturgy, and protocol, few expected that Leon XIV would hide among his habits a pastime that seems at first glance somewhat unpapal, playing tennis, and not as an occasional hobby, but as regular discipline, as body language, as a metaphor for life. Because for him, tennis is not just a sport, it's a spiritual pedagogy. From a young age, Robert Prevost became interested in tennis. He had no professional ambitions, no dreams of tournaments, but he found something much deeper in that sport: concentration, humility, resilience. He learned that points are won one by one, that each mistake teaches that you cannot fight against the net or the wind, but you can fight against yourself. During his years in Peru, he didn't leave his racket behind. He took it with him on missionary trips, organizing impromptu matches with the youth from the parishes, not to compete, but to coexist. In a country marked by inequality, where few had access to such sports, he broke the mold. It didn't matter if you were good or if you knew how to listen to the ball and not give up after a bad set. That phrase was repeated by many of the young people who knew him. It wasn't a technical teaching. It was a lesson in life because Prevost didn't use tennis as an escape, but as a tool to connect, to teach patience, to say without words that a leader can also make mistakes, sweat, and lose. In the rural towns where he served, there were no official courts, but he would mark lines with chalk on the ground, set up an improvised net between two trees, and there, with children who had never held a racket, he would laugh, stumble, sweat, win, and lose. And at the end, he would pray, because yes, after every match, he invited those present to a brief prayer, thanking for the gathering, for fair play, for the health of the bodies. And many times, he would then celebrate Mass with the same simplicity with which he had played. A young Augustinian who was his student remembers that it was rare for a bishop to play tennis and then confess that he sweated with us and spoke to us about the gospel. That style, so little clerical and not formal, left a lasting impression on those around him because it showed that authority does not come from distance, but from closeness, that a shepherd does not need to seem untouchable to be respected, and that a pope, before preaching, must know how to smile. Over time, that custom remained. Even as a bishop and later as prefect in Rome, he sought out spaces to play, not with a sporting ambition, but as spiritual balance, as a way to meditate in movement, as a physical expression of a faith that is truly embodied. One of the religious who worked with him in Lima recounts that more than once she saw him arrive to the morning Mass with hands marked by the tennis racket handle, and that did not scandalize her, but moved her. It was proof that she also prayed with her body. Today, as Pope Leo XIV, he has not played publicly. But in the corridors of the Vatican, some are already commenting that he requested a small court be kept standing at the papal summer residence, not for competition, but to continue listening to the voice of God in every bounce of the ball. The athletic profile of Leo XIV is not an isolated detail. It is an embodied expression of his way of understanding spiritual life, because, for him, the body is not the enemy of the soul. It is its first language, its first cathedral. And in this theology of movement, tennis became a practice that goes beyond exercise. It is a prayer with rhythm. Those who have known him since his formative years affirm that his love for sports was never an eccentricity or a luxury pastime. It was a space where he practiced evangelical values, the humility of failing, the persistence of insisting, the respect for others, even in competition. A sport that, according to him, forces you to confront your limits without giving up on improvement. During his years as an Augustinian superior in Peru, he would often invite young people from marginalized neighborhoods to share a sporty afternoon in the parish courtyards. There were no trophies or medals, just smiles, fresh water, and a hug at the end. After the game, everyone would head to the chapel, and there, tired and barefoot, they would pray together an Our Father. For him, that was the true triumph. The community, that style, also not clerical, caused bewilderment in some more traditional sectors of the church. On one occasion, a European visitor commented that he did not think it appropriate to see a bishop in sportswear in a rural village. Prevost's response was simple. Sometimes the best way to talk about God is without words. With his feet on his walk through Rome, as prefect of the dicastery for bishops, he reserved a weekly hour when his duties allowed for playing with seminarians or Vatican workers. This small but constant gesture was even noticed by collaborators of Pope Francis, who regarded it as a natural way to connect with people who would normally not have access to a high-ranking official of the Curia. A Vatican gardener remembers with a smile, "I did not know it was so important. I found out when his name appeared on television, but before that he had already won me over." In 2 sets for Leon XIV, tennis was also spiritual therapy. In past interviews, he acknowledged that he turned to that physical space to process tensions, doubts, and even moments of pastoral sadness. He said that the repetition of movement, deep breathing, and the silence of the court helped him reconnect with his inner center. That practice saved him in key moments, like when he was transferred from Peru to Rome, a decision that tore him apart inside, or when he had to deal with the crisis of abuse within the church, a topic that deeply affected him due to having been a pastor in vulnerable areas. There on the court, he found clarity, not solutions, but peace. Today, as Pope, his agenda is different. The obligations are different. The weight of the world rests on his shoulders. But those who know him say he hasn't changed his essence. He still is a man who needs a quiet corner to move, to think, to let grace act between every stroke. A cardinal who has accompanied him since the conclave recounted that after finishing his first private mass as pontiff, Leon XIV jokingly whispered, "I miss my racket." But today, he has a different kind of match, and perhaps he is right. For now the game is not played between white lines, but rather among invisible boundaries. It is no longer just about sets. It is about souls. And although the score is still unwritten, Leon XIV seems ready to fight every point with faith, humility, and the same determination he had when teaching others to play and believe in a small Andean town before donning white robes, before slipping into sober black shoes, and even before being named bishop or cardinal. Leon XIV was simply known as Father Bob. This was how he was recognized in the poorest communities of northern Peru, where he spent over a decade walking through hills, sands, and dirt roads, carrying the gospel in a backpack and the Eucharist in a cloth bag. Chulucanas, Piura, Morapon, names that rarely appear on the maps of ecclesiastical power but were the backdrop for one of the most silent and profound missions of the now Pope. There, in those hot, dusty lands, Robert Prevost learned what it means to be church from the bottom up. His arrival was not celebrated with bells. No one awaited him with processions. He was a tall young Augustinian friar, a foreigner with a pronounced accent and attentive eyes. He had been assigned to a difficult pastoral area, affected by structural poverty, infrastructure without electricity, without access to health care, and with open wounds from the political violence that ravaged Peru in the 80s. But he was not frightened. He did not lock himself away in the parish house. He went out, walked, asked, made mistakes, and learned. His first steps were timid. He celebrated Mass in improvised chapels, sometimes under a palapa of dry leaves, sometimes under a tree, and other times inside a family kitchen where the smoke from the fire mixed with the incense. What was never lacking was the gospel, nor the bread, nor the wine, even if they were minimal. Over time, he began to weave himself into the human fabric of the place. He not only celebrated, he listened. He not only preached, he carried buckets of water. He helped fix roofs made of corrugated metal and accompanied the burials where there was no coffin, only a blanket and an improvised cross. A community leader remembers him this way. He was the only one who did not ask about the parish register. He asked about those whom no one visited. That gaze of compassion, more than a pastoral strategy, made his presence welcomed with trust. People saw in him a priest who did not need a throne to preach, a man who did not bring magical solutions but faith that comforts, who did not speak from above but from beside them. The area was hostile. The terrorism of the Shining Path had penetrated many communities. Distrust was the norm, but Father Bob did not wear a uniform, did not carry fear, and that saved him more than once. In an unpublished testimonial, a nun who worked with him recounted, "There was once when he was intercepted on a road. They asked him if he was a gringo priest. He replied, 'Yes, and I walk with you, not above you.' They let him go. That way of being present, without invading, close without controlling, deeply marked those who lived with him. When he was appointed bishop years later, many cried not from sadness but from gratitude because they knew he had not used them as a stepping stone. He had loved them. Today, from the balcony of St. Peter's, when Leon Bofrancane addresses the world, there are peasants in northern Peru who still call him Father Bob because for them, the Pope is not a foreigner. He is the man who prayed with them when they lost a child. He is the man who carried his wooden cross during Holy Week without asking for cameras. He is the same one who, dressed in a worn soutane, sat down to eat rice with bananas without shame or distance. It was no coincidence that Robert Prevost, now Leon XIV, developed such a finely tuned sensitivity over the years, was shaped by years of walking through dust, tears, impromptu wakes, and hands cracked from labor. His theology was not written in books. It was inscribed in the hot earth of Chulucanas, where the gospel was not a biblical citation, but a daily necessity in the communities he served. It was common to see him arrive drenched in sweat, with his cassock rolled up, carrying a backpack that contained not scrolls or documents, but gas, thermometers, medications, and bread. Because where there was no doctor, he was the comfort. Where the state could not reach, his faith arrived. A local nurse recounted an anecdote that now circulates like legend. Once a child fractured his leg. There was no ambulance. Father Bob carried him 4 kilometers to the medical post. We never saw him stop. We never heard him complain. His mission was not one of mere assistance. He did not come to give charity, but to accompany, and he did so with a presence that sought not recognition, but shared redemption. He felt that faith should touch wounded bodies, not just hearts. That's why he often said, "The Eucharist does not begin at the altar. It begins in the widow's house, who cries alone." During his years as a vicar and then as a bishop in those areas, he initiated community projects that marked generations, from carpentry workshops to community kitchens, rural schools, family gardens, and small listening centers for women victims of violence, always with a principle of not imposing, but planting seeds and waiting. In a meeting with peasant leaders before being appointed bishop, he said a phrase that is still remembered. "He who wants to serve learns to be silent. He who wants to shepherd gets his shoes dirty. And he got them dirty, not once but many times, crossing streams on foot, getting muddy on winter paths, allowing dogs to follow him, children to tug at his cassock, and adults to invite him to humble soups without any protocol. Over time, he earned the respect of entire communities not through canonical authority, but through a coherent life. When he was ordained bishop, people did not see him as someone being elevated in rank. They saw him as someone who would carry their sorrows further. They embraced him, wept for him, blessed him with branches of dry olive. And today, many of them, without internet connection, social networks, or media, have learned that Father Bob is now Pope Leo. They have learned through letters, word of mouth, and printed photographs. They show their now more aged face, but with the same smile a 76-year-old catechist said upon seeing his image on an improvised poster, "He is not the Pope. He is our brother who went to tell the world that the poor also exist." And in that phrase perhaps lies the root of it all. Because while the Vatican analyzes his pontificate, while analysts measure his gestures, while social media debates his style in the ravines of northern Peru, there is only gratitude. Why? Because they know that the world is getting to know today the same man they knew years ago. The same one who before raising his voice in Rome lent it to those who had no voice. During the weeks leading up to the conclave, rumors pointed to a long process with internal tensions, divisions by ideological blocks, and strong pressure to achieve impossible consensus. There was talk of heavyweight cardinals in Europe, of influential figures in Africa, of discreet but firm candidates in Latin America. But no one, not even the most veteran analysts, predicted what occurred. The election of Robert Prevost was one of the fastest in recent decades. In less than 5 ballots, his name was repeated over and over until the majority leaned towards him without the need for complex negotiations or improvised alliances. It was an election that did not obey the traditional logic of ecclesiastical power. It was, as some cardinals said, a motion of the Spirit. Several media outlets did not take long to ask how a relatively new cardinal in Rome with little public visibility managed to achieve such a level of consensus in such a short time. The answer began to emerge among discreet testimonies. It was not his speech, it was his silence. It was not his strategy, it was his trajectory. During the meetings prior to the conclave known as General Congregations, Prevost did not monopolize the floor. He listened, observed, spoke only when he felt he should. And what he said was not ideological, it was pastoral. He did not propose revolutionary reforms, but he did sow questions that many had been waiting years to hear. One of the European cardinals recounted to an Italian media outlet, "When he spoke, he did not do it to convince. He did it to invite. He did not lay out a plan. He shared a wound, and that wound that of a church, often disconnected from the poor, from the youth, from the peripheries, was the one that touched something deep among the voters, because beyond his passport or his title, what was being voted on was the presence of Prevost was unmistakably sober, faithful, and devoid of a desire for protagonism. An African cardinal shared privately that he did not campaign or make promises. His life spoke for him. This detail, confirmed by sources close to the conclave, left even members of the Curia perplexed, as they had expected a more predictable profile. Yet that was precisely what set the difference apart. The election of Leon XIV was not the result of political calculation. It was a kind of spiritual necessity, a common whisper among cardinals from different continents who unknowingly sought the same thing: someone with soul. The silent election of Robert Prevost, the missionary who walked in the dust, the bishop who played tennis with young people, the pastor who spoke little but listened a lot, became the great surprise that even the most expert Vatican watchers could not anticipate. While the world seemingly bet on eloquence and strategy, the Spirit, Holy Spirit, chose coherence. The speed at which Robert Prevost was elected Leon XIV not only took international media by surprise, but also shook the very foundations of the Vatican itself, where it is often presumed that the processes of papal succession are deeply marked by negotiations, power blocks, low diplomacy, and tensions between opposing visions of the Church. This time, there was none of that. A Latin American cardinal later recounted after the conclave that there was a common whisper among all. We had not spoken it aloud, but we carried it in our hearts, and that whisper, like a breeze between columns, ultimately transformed into an election. Not due to charisma, not due to influence, but something harder to define yet more powerful: trust. In the days leading up to the vote, many expected lengthy discussions. There were talks of a possible paralysis due to a lack of agreements, but when Prevost's name appeared for the first time on the ballots, it was not as a weak proposal, but as an unexpected clamor. Every time his name was read, there were silent nods, glances that needed no explanation, for he represented what many desired without knowing how to name it. He was a man without scandals, without known ambitions, without pressure groups behind him, but with something that became evident as he walked the halls of the Vatican, an authority that did not need to impose itself, flowing from his history rather than his position. Less visible in the final decisions found in Prevost, a figure of unity not by calculation, but by shared experience, because he too came from the South not by geography, but by spirit. For having walked among the last, for having wept with the poor, for having prayed in silence more times than from pulpits. One of the cardinal electors from Eastern Europe said it clearly in a later interview. "We didn't know we were looking for him until he appeared in our prayers." And perhaps that is why the detail that surprised the Vatican was not just the name of the chosen one, but the way it happened. The simplicity, the calm, the absence of tension, the air of real prayer that covered the Sistine Chapel. When the Accepto was pronounced, the chosen name also caused impact. Leon XIV. A nod to Leon XIII. The Pope who in the midst of the Industrial Revolution defended workers, wrote the encyclical Rerum Novarum and traced the beginning of modern social doctrine. It was not a neutral name, it was a declaration. And that is why, upon hearing that name, some cardinals looked at each other, knowing that they had not only chosen a new pope, they had charted a course. The news traveled the world, but in the hallways of the Vatican, the astonishment was not for the election itself, it was for the internal feeling that for once it was not about votes, but about souls that recognized another soul. Today, while millions see him as a symbol of renewal, while many discover his years of mission, his love for Peru, his humility, his firm but serene gaze, those who chose him know something more intimate, that it was not a media phenomenon, nor a favorite of analysts, nor a familiar face. It was simply a shepherd. And that was enough. You need strength, faith, and a new beginning. Download the ebook 50 Prayers for the Soul and Life. Inspired by Pope Leon XIV, includes an exclusive bonus guide to prayers for prosperity. Click on the link in the pinned comments and in the description. Yeah,